You're listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, episode number 78. Cue the intro music, guys.
Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Did you know that the fastest rate of brain growth happens in the first 3 years of life? Did you know that most of the calories burned in baby's first year is centralized in the brain? More than 1 million neural connections will be formed each second in the first 3 years. What happens in the brain is literally mind-boggling. We know that nutrition is a big part of the brain development blueprint, but there is so much more to it. Here to help us understand what's going on with brain development and how nutrition, environment, experiences, and relationships help babies make the most of their brain potential is Dr. Bob Murray. You can find the show notes for today's episode over at www.jillcastle.com/078. That's 078 for episode number 78. Hey there, how are you today? Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast. I'm Jill Castle, your host, and I am a pediatric dietitian nutritionist, and I've been working in this field for over 27 years. I'm also a mom to 4 children, most of which are grown and flown into the college arena. The ones that are still here at home with me are in high school. But I am so happy you're here today, and I'm super excited to bring my guest, Dr. Bob Murray, to you. If you don't know him, he is an amazing pediatrician, and I will do his bio and intro in just a second, but I wanted to just give you a little update about what's going on with me. So I'm just back from February vacation with my son, who goes to Florida every year on February break for rowing practice. And in the Northeast, where we live, the winters are long and the crew team spends a lot of time indoors, erging and lifting weight. So it's right around mid-February when the true burnout starts to set in. The boys and girls start to question why they devote so much time to this sport. They start to lose sight of why they do it. And honestly, I think the love of the water is a big part of why a lot of the kids do it. And getting out of the cold weather and down south where they can get on the water rejuvenates and inspires them all. I'm not going to lie, it's fun for me too. I love the warmer weather and try to spend as much time as I can outside while I'm down there. I walk, I run, I play golf, I lounge poolside and at the beach. I chum around with my crew team, mom and dad friends, and get to have some fun with the coaches as well. My son's coach is a former 2-time Olympian, Dan Walsh. If you aren't familiar with him, I interviewed him back in episode number 40, and I'll link up episode number 40 in the show notes so you can quickly get to it if you want to listen to him. He and I talk about nutrition and what young rowers need to be thinking about when it comes to the fuel and the food they put in their bodies every day. It's a great episode for your young athletes, and it doesn't have to be an athlete who's a rower. Any sport can listen to this episode with Dan Walsh and really get a lot out of it. And Dan he's just a great guy. He has 2 young daughters and understands the importance and impact an adult has on a child, especially in the arena of sports. I truly love to watch him have a hand in the transformation of my boy to a young man. And in fact, all of the coaches where my son is do such a great job at this and have such a powerful and positive influence on the young athletes there. As you listen to this episode, I am in Hawaii with my business coach for a retreat, a working retreat. I've been working with a coach for over a year now, and this retreat is the culmination and, quite frankly, reward for the work we've done, for me anyways, the work I've done and we've done together for the last 18 plus months. So while I will be working on some of the next big things I want to tackle, both personally and professionally, I'll also be taking the time to honor myself and the hard work I've put into my business over the last 2 years. I'll be back in March when I launch into the speaking season and more travel. I hope to see some of you in my travels. I'll be at the CACFP annual meeting in Chicago. I'll be on Long Island for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics meeting. I'll be in New Jersey for the American Academy of Pediatrics meeting. Today's Dietitian in Scottsdale. Nutrition Adventures in Kansas City, the Pediatric Nutrition Practice Group and Dietitians and Nutrition Support meeting in Charlotte, and in St. Louis for the School Nutrition Association meeting. So I have a busy speaking agenda, but I have to say it is so much of my fulfillment and excitement and purpose surrounds these types of events and the opportunity it gives me to spread the word of nourishing the whole child using food, feeding, and development. So just a quick reminder, at this juncture, Fearless Feeding is out. It's released. If you haven't seen some of the ads and the marketing push Marianne and I put forward, it is out there. And if you haven't seen it, I'm sorry you haven't, but I'm here to tell you now, you can get the second edition of Fearless Feeding on Amazon. The print version is there. I suspect at the time of this recording, the ebook version will be there as well by the time this show goes live. And Try New Food, the workbook, is also available on Amazon. I invite you to write a review about each of those books. These reviews on Amazon help tremendously. So if you have the time, please let others know what you think of the books. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Bob Murray. I met Bob a few years ago at a meeting we both attended. Since then, we've run into each other several times, and I even had the opportunity to speak to the Ohio chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, of which he was president at the time. So I have a lot of respect for him, and when I listened back to this recording, I have to say, I feel Bob is the epitome of what a pediatrician is supposed to be. He exudes warmth, practicality, and passion for his work. And I think you'll feel the same way as you listen to him talk about brain development in young children. Dr. Murray is a pediatrician specializing in gastrointestinal diseases and nutrition, and has spent his 30-year career in the Ohio State University School of Medicine. He has been and is a clinical pediatric GI and nutrition practitioner and researcher. In the 1990s, he developed an interest in school nutrition policy and the rising incidence of weight problems in children. He spent 10 years on the AAP's Council on School Health, served as the pediatric medical director at Abbott Nutrition for 3 years, and during the last 5 years of his clinical career served as medical director of the Center for Healthy Weight, providing medical and surgical weight management for children and teens. He is the immediate past president of the Ohio chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and he currently serves as a consultant to several nutrition organizations, including the National Dairy Council, Egg Nutrition Center, Dannon, Cattlemen's Beef Association, Abbott Nutrition, Happy Family Company, and Nature's One Company. He also serves on the executive board for Children's Hunger Alliance and for Action for Healthy Kids. So Dr. Murray is also obviously a very busy man, but he's a father and a grandfather and gets a lot of joy out of his grandchildren. So I want to also let you know I've placed a brief summary of the important nutrients for baby in the show notes over at jillcastle.com/078. Head over there. You can download the cheat sheet. It's free. It will help you target foods that will supply some of the nutrients Dr. Murray discusses in this episode. Again, that free cheat sheet summary of baby nutrients is over in the show notes at jillcastle.com/078. Hi, Bob. Welcome to the Nourish Child podcast.
Thanks, Jill. It's good to be here.
I'm really glad to have you on the show. I've known you for a couple of years now. We've definitely intersected over joint projects and conference meetings, and even your role as the Ohio Academy of the AAP. I think we've overlapped there as well. So, but I would love my audience to hear in your own words who you are, what you do, and what your background is.
Okay. Well, I'm a pediatrician, and I specialized in gastroenterology and nutrition. Had a 30-year career at Ohio State University. And along with clinical practice, I did some bench research and clinical research early on. And I got interested in obesity in the 90s because it was clear that there was a problem developing quickly. And the thing I was most interested in was school health policy and practice in the way as a means of tackling some of the problems related to child weight and lack of physical activity. So I got interested in that and worked for a long time with the AAP on that issue, writing some policy statements, and then ran a weight management center for 5 years, mostly with adolescents and late childhood obesity. So kind of been all over the place, but obesity has been one of the featured areas for me in my GI practice.
We're not going to talk about obesity today because I actually just interviewed a couple of practitioners from Boston Children's Hospital, the ones that are running David Ludwig's OWL program, which I'm sure you've heard about that.
Yes.
But we're going to talk about babies, young children, young toddlers, and their brain development and brain health. And I know that's an area that you've gotten more and more involved in over the last couple of years. And so I want to kind of explore that with you and break it down for parents so that they understand, what's happening with their newborn, young infant, older infant, young toddlers, brain development, and how that all relates to nutrition, but more importantly, nutrients and even the feeding that's happening. So let's start with what exactly is happening in the brain during that infancy, postnatal infancy, early childhood phase.
Well, it's a fascinating area. The reason I got into this area coming from obesity was because you see more and more that the key issues are tied with early childhood and parenting and nutrition and habits. And so I've ended up kind of really focusing attention on early childhood complementary feeding. You mentioned post-birth, but the story really begins back in pregnancy, and it has to do with the environment that the mother's activity and nutrition and physical fitness and health have to do with creating an environment that allows the child to develop optimally around their genetic potential. And so much of what mom does is visited on the baby in terms of development, and it changes the baby's development away from optimal if the mom has poor nutrition or nutrient depletion or is extremely sedentary or gains too much weight or doesn't gain enough weight. So the nutrition story starts early, but the brain is a fascinating piece of the story that's begun just to be cleared just in the last few decades as technology has given us a chance to really look at the child brain. It's become a much more compelling story. So you and I have talked before, but at birth, if everything goes well in the pregnancy, at birth, the baby has 85 billion neurons, brain cells, and they're ready to go. But the wiring between them, the connections between them are very rudimentary. And as soon as that baby comes through the birth canal, there is an explosion of information that hits this baby. And, I always say that when the baby comes out of their warm, watery, floaty world in the uterus, all of a sudden they're wet, they're cold, it's bright, it's noisy, there's a lot of activity around them. They're breathing, they're feeling gravity for the first time on their body, and their limbs are free to move. And it's a time when a lot of information hits the baby, sensory motor, and immediately the baby's brain begins to wire. And lays down connections between those 85 billion neurons at a rate that's been measured at 700 new synapses, new connections per second.
Wow.
So the baby is just wired to absorb information and begin that process.
Yeah. So when I think about that, what occurs to me, and just to sort of help parents understand, and tell me if this is a good analogy or not, but I'm thinking of when you lay a brick flooring, you lay the bricks with about half an inch of space in between them, but you lay all these bricks side by side. I'm envisioning those are the cells, and the grout, which connects everything, I'm envisioning as sort of those neural connectors. Although obviously the grout would be able to go, left, right, top, bottom, everywhere to connect. But is that something that could make sense for parents to think about the brain in terms of the cells that are all there, those 80 plus, I think you said billion cells?
85 billion, yeah.
85 billion. And the grout would be sort of like that neuronal connector.
And, the interesting thing about neurons is that they can connect widely, and each neuron, when the brain is done wiring, will have contact with 15,000 other neurons. And so you're starting with 85 billion. You can imagine you now have trillions of connections in the brain. And the thing that parents need to know is that how that wiring occurs, how that connectivity occurs, has everything to do with the baby's experiences. So in a rich environment where adults are talking with the baby and reading to the baby and playing with the baby, and they have this constant back and forth, what the Academy of Pediatrics calls serve and return. In that environment, the baby wires very strongly and very fast. The worst thing that we can do to a baby is to neglect them. The brain does not wire well, and that's permanent. And the baby is a social animal, and it's that social person-to-person thing that really wires the brain.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've probably seen this. I know I've seen it in my years of working, in hospitals. We do see children who are unfortunately neglected. And I always have wondered what, when you look at those kids 10, 20 years down the road, what are we seeing as adults as an outcome of early neglect?
Oh, it's devastating for the child because, the brain is expanding so fast during this time because of the synapses, the connections between the neurons being laid down, but also because along those connections, they're laying down fat called myelin, and myelinating is like insulating an electric wire. And so it makes those connections move very, very quickly. And this is really the platform on which the baby's future thinking and abstract reasoning and skills will come. So this is occurring, and it's occurring so fast that the baby's brain is going to double in size in just the first 12 months, and then triple in size by 36 months, almost to an adult size. And the reason is that the baby is undergoing a sensory motor exploration all day, every day. They are trying to understand their world. And as I said, if they're in a very rich social environment, they will build that well. If they're in a depleted environment with neglect, they simply don't wire, and it's a permanent deficit. IQ falls, and it's just a disaster for the baby. Probably the worst thing you could do, even worse than abuse. At least with abuse, the baby has someone paying attention to it. Neglect is probably the worst thing you could do for the life of the child.
Yeah, that makes me sad thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, this whole attachment, if you look at some of the developmental literature, the attachment is that, very first, most important social emotional milestone, I guess, if you will, that occurs for baby. And this serve and return phrase I've not heard before, but it does. For me, it says, responsiveness, which I can,
Yes.
Mentally attach to feeding, early infant feeding, and toddler feeding, quite frankly. And actually, you could extend it all the way into teenagerhood. But
That's right.
But responsiveness, serve and return, attachment, so the brain is really just like a sponge, soaking all of that up and making sense of it, right? Connecting those cells so that intelligence is building, cognition.
Absolutely. And the ability to use their genetic potential, their cognitive potential, that ability is really unfolded in an environment where the child and adults, and it's not just parents, it's adults, get into this back and forth serve and return relationship with the child. And you're right, it's not just words or communication skills, but it has to do with everything we do, including feeding, playing. As we work around the house, a very famous pediatrician, T. Barry Brazelton, called that the magic of everyday moments. It's those little bursts of exchange. That's really what parenting is, and that's what makes strong parenting.
Yeah. I got to actually work with him when I had my time at Children's Hospital. Very brief, but he was amazingly fascinating to listen to. I always kind of think of him as the baby whisperer.
Yeah. He certainly gave a lot of us perspective.
Yeah.
On what's the baby thinking, what's the baby feeling, getting out of our adult mentality and getting into the mind of the baby. That's really what responsive parenting is.
Mm-hmm. So let's take a little bit of a dive into nutrition and talk nutrients for a little bit, because I know that is an area where parents are interested in knowing. I get questions all the time. I see questions all the time. What should I be feeding my baby? What nutrients are most important? What happens when they don't get enough nutrients? So let's focus on what you and what we know from the research literature is important for a baby's brain development in terms of nutrients.
Yeah, we're still learning a great deal about how the individual nutrients work. I think people recognize that the introduction of DHA and ARA, the omega-3 fatty acids, to infant formula has only occurred since the year 2000. And dialogue about a number of new nutrients is ongoing. The impact of iron, the importance of iodine. Choline is one that has a very strong literature now indicating that the brain is highly dependent on choline to make those neurotransmitters that make communication between neurons work. And some new ones like lutein, which we've always associated with eye health, appears to have a role in the baby's brain, heavily concentrated in the brain in the third trimester before birth and then after birth. So we're still learning about these individual nutrients. The point I've always tried to make to doctors and dietitians is that it's not the individual nutrients, though, that are helping to build and maintain the brain. It requires all of them, and it requires a consistent flow of nutrition that is balanced and complete. Because if you start to get into individual nutrients, I'm going to worry about omega-3s, you may miss the point of diet quality in really supporting the growth of the baby. And the brain is one of the 4 areas that I point out. There's length, which is growing very fast. Baby, this time of life is the fastest rate of growth in life. And so the baby in the first couple of years is growing very fast linearly. Weight is doubles in 4 months, triples in 12 months. This baby's putting on a lot of muscle tissue and organic growth. But also, the baby's still refining and developing organ systems after birth. We kind of feel sometimes like they're a bun in the oven, and when they come out, they're done, But you think about the fact the GI tract is very immature and requires a lot of refinement postnatally. The immune system is almost non-existent in the baby until it begins to develop. We develop the whole bacterial microbiome postnatally. So it's not just height and weight, but it's also refinement and development of organs that continue to go very quickly. And then the fourth one is this spectacular brain development and function. And parents have a role in all of those in supporting them. And as I said, I think diet quality is the real key to thinking holistically about the child's diet and not getting lost in individual nutrients so much.
Yeah, as I work with families one-on-one, I feel like sometimes I have my ear to the pavement in terms of what's on their mind. You're singing my language when you say whole child and the whole diet and balanced. But what I'm hearing from parents is things like, sugar is toxic, and I'm really focused on sugar and getting sugar out of my child's diet. Or I hear baby cereal is not this, that, or the other. It's toxic. I'm going to skip it. Or, there are all kinds of trends that, and I think this is true for everything. They have their upsides, they have their downsides. And so how do we sort of guide parents to really sort of take that moderate road and give that full, wholesome, nutrient-rich diet that's well-balanced, not only just for meeting their needs for all these amazing areas of growth that are happening, physical growth, but also for those later in life things like establishing healthy eating habits and establishing healthy food preferences. So when you think about societal trends in feeding young children, is there anything that crops up or concerns you as you think about those things?
Yeah, I think the trend has been to become so obsessive about individual things. And we've done this story over and over again with total fat and saturated fat and cholesterol and high fructose corn syrup. And we just have a legacy of getting obsessive about individual nutrients, and in particular about ones that we perceive as harmful. But the counterweight to that is to actually look at the baby. And when you begin to introduce solid food, so-called complementary feeding, in addition to milk, you now begin to feed them around 6 months. This is a project for parents to build a high quality diet. And it really is more than avoiding things. It's actually building that diet quality. And it requires them to think in terms of the 5 food groups, giving that baby experiences with nutrient-rich foods in every one of those food groups, and repeatedly giving them a chance to experience those foods over and over and over again. You and I have talked, I think the key to exposing the child to new foods is to let them play with the food. They're wired for play. They love sensory motor exploration. And even if they recoil the first time you give them broccoli or cantaloupe or something, if they have it on their tray, they'll continue to come back to it and play with it again and again. And that exposure gives them the smell, the taste, the texture, the color. And that, to me, is the best way to ensure food preferences are broad enough to support a high quality diet.
I love networking. I'm part of a podcast network called Parents on Demand, or the Pod Network. We are a network of fun and educational podcasts perfect for your family. You can explore the shows in the network by going to parentsondemand.com and searching specific categories. Parents on Demand also has a download for a free network app on iOS and Android, so you can listen to your favorite shows or find new podcasts. Subscribe through iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, iHeartRadio, or another provider. Every month, I will feature a podcast that I think will be helpful or of interest to you. Here's this month's podcast feature.
You've decided to give your baby breast milk. We want to help. We're the Boob Group, a group of moms and experts here to support you in your goals, whether you're breastfeeding, pumping, or something in between. Each week, a group of experienced moms openly discuss their success, their struggles, and society's impact on how they feed their babies. We provide an honest, natural, and judgment-free approach to breastfeeding, pumping, milk sharing, and more. The Boob Group is part of the Parents on Demand network. Look for our free network app in Apple and Android to discover more great parenting shows and listen to your favorite episodes on the go.
I just finished and submitted a manuscript for a workbook edition of a book that I wrote on my website called Try New Food. And it goes through all of what you just said, like how to expose young children to all foods and to not sort of get caught up in, oh, my baby grimaced and she definitely doesn't like broccoli, so we're not going to do that anymore because we don't want to waste it. Or,
Or I don't like broccoli, so my child doesn't need to eat broccoli because I hate the smell of it. I mean, that's a problem too.
Exactly. And this whole idea of adding foods to the diet, not taking away or worrying, but to add nutrient-rich foods. Some of the things, though, that concern me is, as you mentioned earlier, is that people get so hung up on particular foods that they need to remove from the diet. One food I know 5 years ago was, baby cereal. It went through that phase of, I don't remember the doctor, but there was a doctor who said that it was not a good first food for babies, that it was obesogenic and this, that, and the other. And as a clinician, I hear that message and I think, well, gosh, that means there's going to be a lot of parents that are going to skip that. And so do they know what they need to do instead? Because that's a great source of iron and babies need iron. And if you don't have plan B for replacing that food you've eliminated with those nutrients that are so important, then what happens? And
that's very worrisome, particularly with iron. Iron is not something that you want the baby to be insufficient in iron. And breastfed kids around 6 months need not only additional energy, but they need iron. We got into that same problem when we were so fat phobic in the 90s, and everybody was saying, don't eat red meat. It's bad for you in terms of fat. And so parents translated that into baby feeding, and suddenly beef intake fell. And it was replaced by poultry, which is much lower in iron, and also by deli meats like hot dogs, which has very, very little iron, a lot of sodium, and a lot of fat. I mean, just a really low quality protein. And so the combination of what you mentioned, which is cereals kind of going on the outs, and this depletion of iron feeding baby really stripped, when the beef and cereals were eliminated, it really stripped iron from the early diet. And that's just not a good strategy. So instead of thinking about cereals and obesity or beef and saturated fat, I think you have to, again, think in terms of the different food groups and what do I get from these things. And one of the first things they have to do is commit to building dietary sources of iron that really protect the baby, particularly the breastfed baby. The exclusively breastfed baby needs iron and needs those sources of iron in order to protect it.
I know we've nerded out on that topic before.
Yeah. Right.
But think about this, though. Let's throw another food group in the mix, or another food that I think gets missed in this early stage is fish.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Partly, I think that comes about from that, we all grew up, you and me and generations of us have grown up being told that we have to eliminate high protein, potentially allergenic foods early and delay those to 9 months. And so you saw things like eggs and fish and nut butters and other things pushed pretty much out of that first year, that first 6 months of complementary feeding, from 6 months to 12 months. The so-called LEAP trial that looked at peanut allergy startled everyone when it came back that the children who were exposed early to peanut proteins had a much less likelihood of developing symptoms of allergy than those who had the delay. And that means that, the good news is that you can and should be exposing the baby to these other proteins early. The feeling is, when you begin complementary foods, the protein group is one of the important ones, and you don't have to feel constrained about keeping them away from the baby. But the other thing for parents is it liberates the parent to now build the diet in terms of all 5 of the food groups, not being afraid of food so much, and instead getting a different mandate, a different assignment to parents, which is, I want you to really consciously pick out those high nutrient foods. I want them to be repeatedly offered to the child to make sure that they accept them. And I want you to think in terms of all the diet, all 5 food groups. It's not, we don't do well at all with vegetables, particularly green vegetables. Only about 7% of infants are given a green vegetable on any given day. And when you look at the second year, it's only a little bit higher than that. It's only about 8%. These are the kind of things that I think are big mistakes on the part of parents. And it's, as you say, they focus on these negative things. I'm going to keep juice away from my child, or I'm going to try and eliminate all sugar or all starchy foods or something. But they don't think about building that broad, strong dietary pattern for the baby that really gives them all the nutrients they need for height, weight, organ development, and brain development. Parents' job is to build a strong dietary pattern from all the 5 food groups. One glaring hole is vegetables, particularly green vegetables. Yellow vegetables are a little bit better because of baby food. Although I've noted in the Feeding Infants and Toddlers study that we do a pretty good job of yellow vegetables in the 6 to 12 month range when baby foods are available. But in the next year, it actually falls. The amount of yellow vegetables fall. But green vegetables, in 6 to 12 months, only about 7% of babies on any given day are eating a green vegetable. And a year later, it's only about 8%. And we just never start feeding kids vegetables well. And as a result, their food preferences eliminate them. So if you think about it in terms of the 5 food groups, fruits, vegetables, grains and whole grains, dairy, and then quality proteins, we start out these babies with one of the food groups almost totally gone. And then, as we mentioned with beef, a lot of times deli meats take precedence during this time. About 30% of kids are getting deli meats on a given day. So quality proteins are getting pushed out at the same time. And this is, I think, the real risk of focusing on the negatives, the things that might be harmful, rather than focusing on how do I get really high quality foods surrounding this baby at every meal and snack, and mix and match those 5 food groups. If you stay true to that and you're looking for nutrient-rich foods in all the 5 food groups, you will automatically begin to push out excess sugars and other types of things that might be harmful to the baby.
Yeah. And I think, what our advice in infant nutrition has dramatically and radically changed. I mean, as you mentioned, instead of being fearful of certain foods in the first year of life, we're actually saying, put the pedal on the metal and let's actually get as, much variety within each of those different food groups as we can, which means introduce beef, introduce fish, eggs, all of those things that are going to have those nutrients that we're talking about today, which is, or particularly for the brain development, but also vegetables, whole grains, because, we could go on and have a completely different podcast, and I probably should do this, on the development of food preferences and how essential, that first 5 years of life is, but particularly the first 2 years, 3 years, in establishing food preferences. I have clients that have toddlers who are, that their parents think that they are sweet obsessed. Like, that comes from food introduction.
Right. Yeah.
For the most part.
It's a learned behavior. I mean, they prefer sweets. They love sweets, but
right.
It's interesting that you say that, because one of my granddaughters was a tremendous eater. When you put food in front of her, the first thing she ate was vegetables. She loved foods, but she also loved M&Ms. And so, you could see my daughter kind of squirming a little bit with the M&Ms, but in truth, this child ate beautifully, and a little bit of M&Ms on top of it wasn't going to do anything to dilute the quality of her diet. And I think that is where parents should take comfort. If they do this job well from 6 months to 24 months, and they help the child get good food preferences for a lot of different nutrient-rich foods, and all 5 food groups and snack foods are strong, they don't have to worry about if the child wants a sugar-sweetened cereal or if they want M&Ms sometimes. It's just not a big deal.
I agree. And I feel like that's how I raised my 4 children. And I know that I credit that to my knowledge in nutrition. And that's another thing I think that a lot of parents in the United States are facing right now, is just that lack of knowledge, that lack of sort of clear-cut, what do we do? And what comes next? And what's the next step after that? And how do I handle, the child who gets really excited about sweets? Parents fear that. They're afraid of that. But you're exactly right. a well-balanced diet will sort of combat the, indulgences, as long as that balance is in favor of nutrient-rich foods and a variety of them.
Yeah, and that's true for adults nutrition as well as child nutrition. I feel I do the same thing that you've been mentioning, and I have to say your blog and your books are very practical, and that's what we have not given to parents in the past in nutrition. We haven't given them a sense of practical nutrition that they can feel proud of. They're always afraid anymore that they're doing something wrong and that they're going to harm the child, as opposed to constructing this foundation that they can be proud of.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's talk about feeding approaches, because I think that, we've talked about food and nutrients and development in terms of, brain growth and development. Let's talk about the feeding approach, because there's a lot of conversation around, which is the best way. Should we do baby-led weaning? Should we do spoon feeding? Should we do a combination of both? I think we both are on the same page that we see benefits of all of it, really. It's finding that, that nice balance that works for your family and works for your child. But there are most definitely benefits to each and every method, I think. I have my own preference in terms of what I like to advise, but I'm interested in hearing what you think of the different feeding methods or approaches.
Yeah, I think it's best to do a combination for a number of reasons. I think the real core benefit of baby-led weaning is that it's centered on the child's curiosity and exploration. We look at these babies sitting on rugs and we say they're playing, but they're not really playing. They're studying very, very hard all day, and everything that they come in contact with is new to them. And so they're trying to figure out what it is and what it does and what can they do with it. So you see them pick things up and bang it and click them together and roll them and do all kinds of things to just understand them. Well, that's natural for the baby, and to put food in front of them 6 times a day and let them explore that food with their own skills, their fingers, let them get messy, let them put it on their face so that they smell it and smell it and smell it and taste it. That is, to me, a very powerful way to expose the child to all the different flavors, textures, colors, and smells of food. In addition to that, though, I think that serve and return that we were talking about, that back and forth, is very much heightened during spoon feeding, as the parent is sitting eyeball to eyeball with the child and giving them food, and then both of them respond to the food. They share that, that is extremely powerful. Connectivity between the two. That's where responsive parenting gets reinforced over and over and over again every day.
And I think it's important to note that you can be very responsive any method, any approach that you use. Just like you can be responsive when you're changing your baby's diaper or you're bathing them. I mean, responsivity or being responsive is something that should, ideally be carried out in every interaction, really, especially based on what you were saying earlier in terms of those neurons connecting and babies learning so intensively during that time.
And talk with the baby, whether they're doing baby-led weaning and they're doing the eating, or you're spoon feeding, or you're watching them play, or just talk, and listen to them talk back to you. Even, there was a famous study on the 30 million words gap, where chatty parents will talk to their kids, and by the time the child's 4, they've been exposed to 30 million more words than in families where they just don't talk very much. When they asked the families who don't talk much, why don't you talk to your baby? They said, well, they don't really understand what I'm saying. They don't know the words, so I don't say words to them. But babies are very tuned in to eyes and expression and facial expressions and tone, and even when they can't understand the words, they understand the parent. That back and forth begins at birth as soon as you lock eyes on the baby.
Yeah, you make me so excited to be a grandparent, and my kids hate it when I say that.
It's very fun.
My husband hates that too.
Yeah, you don't think of yourself. Yeah. First you think of yourself in college, and all of a sudden you're a grandparent. But it is one of the great joys. You had 4 kids, I had 3, and it's just a joy to go back and watch development
bet.
over again and participate. And
Oh, I bet.
I really treasure every day I spend with the grandkids.
I bet. I bet it's so joy-filled. Just as a little side note, I'm sure you saw all the NIH study and the review on 60 Minutes about young children using iPads and TV and media sources, and how I was thinking about that as you described, babies sitting and they're not really playing, they're exploring. But that study showed that babies who would build Legos on their iPad, using a game, would then sit on the floor and not be able to execute the same actions. They would not be able to build with real life Legos.
Yeah.
I thought that was so fascinating.
Yeah. We've grappled with screens, obviously, and they've come on so explosively that we really have an understanding that's kind of behind the curve of this. But we're getting a better and better picture as we're doing brain imaging of what the child takes away from playing on screens. And one of the things I think that's really striking is that there is a clear benefit to having a person-to-person instruction as opposed to a machine showing a child something. There's a part of the brain, there's a certain subset of neurons that are exclusively tuned to humans, to our eyes and our face and our movements. They've done experiments on little babies. If they put toys in front of them that move and make noise and do things, this particular area of the brain does not fire. But if a face comes in front of them, it immediately starts firing. And they can read this within the first hours of life, that the baby is beginning to absorb the humanness around them. This is why talking to the baby and getting close to their face and letting them see your eyes is so important. So I think the takeaway to parents is it's not going to be baby Einstein and cell phones and other things that are going to teach the baby. It's us, person to person, that really opens up that baby's world. And if you want to make your baby really smart, talk with them, play with them, eat with them, spend your day, any chance, magic of everyday moments, as Brazelton said, any opportunity, do a little exchange with them. And that's really where the baby gets very strong wiring.
Now, I can imagine some of my parent listeners out there are thinking about what we've been talking about in terms of nutrition and food and the importance of that healthy, well-balanced diet in terms of their brain development. And I know there are parents of toddlers out there thinking about how challenging it is right now feeding their toddler because they're picky. And so how do we help parents who are very concerned with, brain development and growth and helping their young child reach their potential in this area, but at the same time, they're struggling with the reality that their child is picky?
Yeah, that is such a challenge. One of my granddaughters is extremely picky, the pickiest little girl I've ever seen, and she seems to have had it from the time she was first introduced to food. She's kind of texture phobic, and I think she may be a super taster because you put something that's fairly mild and she overreacts to them. But it's very challenging. And this is where I think you have to really think in terms of servings from the 5 food groups and how you build on the child's preference for certain really strong nutrient-rich foods. How do I augment that and keep at it, keep working at it to expand incrementally each individual strong food that they have? It is difficult. A lot of those kids do not eat vegetables, and when you track them over time, most of them get better, but not all of them. Some of them remain kind of low vegetable eaters. But I always tell parents, do the best you can do. Just be a good nutritionist, be really aware, and take advantage at every opportunity to let them try new things and keep at it. Don't give it up, because over time, most of those kids kind of come back. I remember one of the dietitians, and I can't remember her name, had a little plate that she would put on the table, and she would put new foods there that the kids could play with. They could squish it, they could smell it, they could touch it on their tongue, but they didn't have to eat it. It was just there for them to explore. And she did that frequently to just make the child feel that this wasn't a tug of war between the parent and the child. This was, a natural opportunity to look at something new and see if you like it. And if you don't like it, tell us why you don't like it. What is it that you don't like about it? So that they're using their words to begin to describe what they're eating.
Yeah, I call that a learning plate. I actually work with some very picky eaters, and that's one of the ways that you take the pressure off and, just let them explore. And in terms of building on what kids like, I think that's such an important point to make. I have one little guy I'm working with right now. He's all about cheese and bacon. And so we've done cheese and bacon pizza, bacon cheeseburgers. The other day he said, I want a turkey cheeseburger. I'm like, all right, let's do it. So, and in the older child who's picky eater, they're helping them generate their own ideas and going with that. I think there's a lot to be said for that piece of autonomy that they feel like they're calling some of the shots. Because a lot of times I think picky eaters are feeling like they're being told what to do all the time with a lot of pressure, and they're not in the driver's seat. They're feeling very powerless, and it can help, I think, too.
I do too. That's part of that responsive parenting, and it continues right into adolescence where you allow them more autonomy, but you help guide them. You're still encouraging them and trying to find opportunities. I can't remember where I saw the statistic, but I saw somewhere that almost 70% of vegetable intake among kids and teens is in the form of soups and stocks and stews and casseroles. We always think of fruits and vegetables being like in a raw form, sitting on a plate with a bowl of ranch dressing or something, but kids don't eat them generally that way. And I think a lot of times parents miss the opportunity to take something fairly simple, mashed potatoes and whipped steamed cauliflower in there so that you get a little blend, and just keep looking for opportunities. If you boil a turkey carcass or a chicken carcass with a lot of different vegetables, that stock is extraordinarily powerful as far as having water-soluble vitamins, and you can put it into all kinds of things. When it says add water, you can add that. And I think we've just got to be real creative with getting vegetables in, because nobody, adult or kids, really likes vegetables enough to hit the recommendations. It's just so rare.
Oh, come on now. I like them.
I do. I've learned to like them over time, but I do think it's really tough. You look at adults and they just, as a population, we just don't eat vegetables.
Yeah. Or we're eating a lot of vegetables. We're on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, right.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, that's a different one.
So as we wrap up this talk about babies and food and nutrients, nutrition, attachment, brain development, what top 3 pieces of advice would you like parents who are listening to walk away with?
Well, I think, first of all, early on, if I was talking to a young mom who's pregnant, she needs to be very aware of her own nutrition, recognizing that the baby's future health and their current growth and development and the mom's future health and the pregnancy outcome itself are all part of her strength and her stamina. And nutrition is a very important piece of that, as is activity. Early in life, I would say you've got our best opportunity if you can breastfeed exclusively. It's made up of both nutrients and bioactive substances that protect the baby. It's a really optimal feeding early on. And then when you get to complementary foods, as I said, think in terms of the 5 food groups and servings per day. Make sure the serving sizes are appropriate for the child. Mix and match and really consciously build that child's strong dietary pattern over the tumultuous period between 6 months and 24 months, so that by the time they're 2, they have a wide variety of food preferences, and it'll be much, much easier to deal with feeding that child over time.
I've gone so far in some of my recommendations to parents to say things like, by the age of 2, I'd like to see 30 to 40 different foods from each food group because parents are very concrete.
Yeah.
And I always say, if you can hit those high numbers in each food group by the time your child's 2, when you enter picky eating, it won't be as painful because you'll have a long list.
Right. And the child, too, I think you see kids go into these phases where they get picky but if their food preferences have been well stoked early in life, they'll come back and, they'll all of a sudden say, I'm not eating carrots. And then 6 months later, they're back to eating carrots. And I think the important thing is don't get off the horse just because, you're having a rough patch, keep going. That perseverance is, I think, what really separates success from a sense of frustration.
Mm-hmm. Bob, it's always a joy to talk with you about nutrition, no matter what age group we're talking about. I always love talking about this with you. Tell us where my listeners can find you should they want to connect with you after they listen to this episode.
Well, I can be contacted through the Ohio chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. I'm the immediate past president, and the staff there is pretty good about tracking me down all the time. So people have contacted me and sent me emails, and you're welcome to email me at murraymd@live.com. I'm happy to chat with people. It's a real interesting area, and I guess one takeaway I would say to parents is relax into nutrition and be comfortable and joyful in watching your child eat and explore food. It's very much fun to participate with them in that exploration.
Well said, and I totally agree. Thank you, Bob, so much for coming on The Nourished Child.
Thanks, Jill. Great to talk with you.
You too. Well, that's a wrap, folks. I hope you enjoyed listening to Dr. Murray. I certainly really enjoyed interviewing him. There's a lot going on with babies and brain development, and I hope you found it encouraging to hear there are so many good things that you can do to support your baby or any baby's intellectual development. As you can imagine, we continued to have a rich discussion about this topic after I stopped the recording, and it is just amazing how much importance and emphasis and more research is being done in this area. It is such an important stage of growth and development for all children. If you enjoyed the show, let us know by posting a comment on the show notes over at jillcastle.com/078, or post your comments in my Facebook page, The Nourished Child. As you know, this show is a free resource for nutrition and feeding education. Don't keep it a secret. Go ahead and share this podcast with your family and your friends. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or on one of your favorite Android apps. That way you'll get a notice every time a new episode airs. And if you feel like leaving a review on iTunes, I would be very grateful. Reviews and subscriptions highlight the show so more people can find it. It goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. You are strengthening your food parenting muscle by tuning into this show. In other words, you are helping yourself and by extension, your child. Pat yourself on the back and be sure to give the precious ones in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.